now. And so I think we have a terrific group here who can talk about that with us today. What's particularly important is that we want to understand how this played out in St. Louis, how it played out for our students, and of course for the election professionals who have had to manage this truly remarkable election. And we have a terrific group with us here of folks who've observed the election in many ways. We're joined today by Eric Fay, who is the Democratic Director of Elections for the St. Louis County Board of Elections. Eric, if you would raise your hand so that everyone can see you. Thank you. We're joined as well by Lindsay Gassman, who is the Voter Engagement Fellow at the Gephardt Institute. Lindsay. Thank you. We're joined by Tennyson Holmes, who's a senior studying political science in arts and sciences. He's also a student union senator. Tennyson, thank you. And we're joined by Jason Rosenbaum, who is a politics correspondent at St. Louis Public Radio. Jason. My understanding is, in fact, Jason has a lot of these appearances because people around the country are interested in how politics is working right now, and especially voting. My understanding is we are also scheduled to be joined today by Rick Stream, who is the Republican Director of Elections of the St. Louis County Board of Elections. He is not with us now. I hope he'll be able to join us, but I certainly understand this because, as you can imagine, the County Board of Elections is very busy right now, and they have a lot going on. I have a series of questions that I want to put to our panelists, but I want to emphasize that we have a lot of time left to take questions from the audience at the toward the end of today's event. And we really hope those questions will give you an opportunity to learn about how voting is operated, to raise questions about the challenges involved in voting, especially in this election. So I want to begin with a question for all of our panelists today. And this is particularly a question I want to put to you where I think the answer will be very useful for our students, because we have a lot of students watching this who may have never voted in a presidential election before, may never have observed one before. So the question I would put to you is, what was unique about this particular election experience? People have a lot of assumptions about that. This certainly was an unusual election, but from your perspective, what is unusual and unique about this election? And I'll let you, I hope to hear from all of you, but I'll let you jump in whatever order you want.
Yeah, so I'll go first. So basically, the biggest thing that I take away from this election that's different from others is that students, at least first-time voters, were much more aware and informed and created their own opinions about who they were voting for. So as kids growing up, our major political ideologies are shaped by our parents, and what we think and know about politics all comes from our parents. So in like 2008 and 2012, I remember as a kid, like I was aware of the election, so were my friends, but we didn't know anything about either candidate or either party's position or either candidate's position on anything, but we were just regurgitating what our parents were saying. And then in 2016, I was much more aware, so were my friends, but even then it came down to like what we knew came down to like just one different ideology. So for example, people who were advocating for Hillary Clinton were in favor of inclusivity. They were thrown off by Trump's rhetoric. But then on the other end, people who were voting or who would have voted for Trump per se, even though we couldn't vote, were in favor of his strict immigration policies. And those ideologies also came from our parents. Whereas now we have like the education, the information, and the ability to gather our own answers for things. So that I think that's the biggest thing between this election and other elections.
Terrific, thank you.
So to piggyback off of what Tennyson just said, what I found and what I saw through working with WashU students was that excitement to vote for the first time, and after forming those ideologies, it translated into students being really proactive about voting in this election. So they were making their voting plans early. I was fielding a lot of questions through multiple outlets about how do I switch my voter registration to Missouri? Like, where can I find information about my ballot, et cetera? And so as soon as over the summer, rising first-year students at WashU were asking me these questions about, can I vote in St. Louis yet? I'd like to vote in the August primary. So I've been fielding these questions for months, and it's been really cool to see how proactive people have been, which I think is directly correlates with people getting excited about voting in their first election and really forming their own ideologies and wanting to translate that into a vote.
So this is the fourth presidential election that I've covered. I covered one presidential election as a student reporter at the Columbia Missourian, and one presidential election as a reporter at the Columbia Tribune, one presidential election as a reporter for the St. Louis Beacon, and now two presidential elections for St. Louis Public Radio. I guess that's actually five. So you're clear. It's pretty clear that I'm not thinking that straight a week after the election. And as far as like from a perspective of a Missouri-based reporter, this was the first election where a bunch of Republican incumbents, and I'm putting that in quotes because a number of incumbents were not elected to the office that they were elected to in 2016, were running essentially for full 4-year terms. In 2008, for example, you could have had that situation, but a lot of the Republican incumbents didn't run for re-election, which allowed the Democrats to take over state government. The Democrats retained their control over state government in 2012, and then Republicans took over by and large in 2016. And so what was different for me from a Missouri-based political reporter standpoint is this is the first time in my experience where Republicans swept an election and they didn't take over power from when Democrats had things like the governor's office and other down ballot races. And obviously the other big difference is there was just an incredible increase in either absentee or mail-in voting, the likes of which we've never seen before. I'm sure Eric is going to talk more about that. But that really changed the way people voted. Instead of early voting being this, what I would consider, I don't want to call it a luxury, but kind of an option. It was seen as more of a necessity for people that didn't want to go to a polling place because of fear of getting COVID-19. And what you saw was, especially in St. Louis County, was a great shift of the type of voters that voted one way and the way people voted another. Like there was I would say that the Democrats largely voted either absentee or mail-in, but then once the election day vote came in, even though St. Louis County was still a 60% Democratic county, in some key races, it was very clear that Republicans turned out in person, which was decisive for a couple of races I'm sure we'll talk about.
Thank you. Eric.
Sure. Yeah, I think Jason really hit it on the head, as he almost always does, with the political analysis. That was really a shift we saw, in the August primary and all elections before that. Absentee voting was pretty evenly split between Republicans and Democrats. In the August primary, of the Republican ballots cast, about a third of those were absentee, and of the Democratic ballots cast, about a third of those were absentee. So, but Jason's right. In November, we saw a big shift. The absentee ballots were overwhelmingly Democratic, and the election day votes were Republican. That being said, as was mentioned, prior to COVID, only about 10% of the voters in St. Louis County would vote by absentee ballot. In this November election, we had close to 40% of the voters vote by absentee ballot. And I think, Peter, your point at the beginning was absolutely right, that at least in my time in election administration, more than ever, people were really focused and had questions about the process. I mean, before, people would cast their ballot, mail in their ballot, and we wouldn't hear from them again. And now people were calling us and saying, hey, what happens next to my ballot? What do you do with my ballot? And that was completely new for us. I think a product of the national dialogue. And the third thing I want to point out, while across the country, the turnout was in many respects unprecedented and large and everything like that, in St. Louis County and St. Louis City, it wasn't. As a matter of fact, we had fewer registered voters in St. Louis County than we did in 2008 or 2012. And I think that's a product of the fact that Missouri is not a swing state anymore, and that the national campaigns are not putting a lot of money into Missouri for voter registration. So, and I think, although the final numbers haven't shaken out, I think the voter turnout of the WashU students in particular was about the same as it was in prior presidential elections. So, I think it's a mixed bag in terms of voter enthusiasm in the St. Louis region.
these are terrific points. And what's really interesting is I'm really hearing two things here. One is, as Tennyson said, that really got us starting on this, that this was partly an election about ideas and ideology, and especially how students become engaged with that. And that's certainly a subject we'll be talking about today. It's also an election that's about mechanics. And I thought we could actually spend a little time digging a little deeper on that. If I can ask, especially Eric and Jason, to follow up on this a bit. I'm really thinking about it from an election administration standpoint. We know, as you said, Eric, that nationwide, the number of voters was the highest on record, less so around here. But of course, this election was happening during a pandemic. And if I understand it correctly, it's the first general election in which Missouri was using a different voting mechanism, operating with paper ballots on demand rather than with at least in the last presidential election, I remember using a touch screen. And so I was wondering how that went. What were the challenges that went with that? Were you surprised at how things went? Was it as difficult as you expected? Was it easier than you expected? And I'm wondering what Eric observed, really being in the trenches of that, and what Jason observed as someone covering that on election day.
Well, as I mentioned before, about 40% of the voters voted by absentee ballot in St. Louis County. And that tracked well with the previous elections during COVID this year. So in June, the municipal election, we had about 45% of the ballots cast absentee. In August, about a third, and then 40%. But overall turnout compared to previous elections did not increase. Just the method of voting shifted. And what that meant for us in the trenches, so to speak, was almost having to run two different elections concurrently, meaning we had to run a traditional polling place election day election, and then almost like running a mail ballot election at the same time. And that was a big lift, especially because we hadn't really done it before in St. Louis County and in Missouri. And as you mentioned, in St. Louis County late last year, we purchased new voting equipment, which ended up being a game changer for us. Very fortuitous in that it allowed us to let voters vote at any polling place in St. Louis County. And that's something that hadn't happened before in any other county in Missouri. And, I think it really worked well at the on-campus polling place at Wash U, where I was just looking at the breakdown, and there were a lot of folks who voted there that were not, registered voters on campus, which was the case before. That was just kind of an on-campus polling place for on-campus voters. So that print on demand system for us worked exceedingly well, and really, I think, was one of the things that saved our bacon through this year, where all the other counties were kind of locked into the precinct-based voting model. Be curious to see how or if that evolves in the future, but that was a big thing for us.
First of all, can you hear me okay? My computer crashed. Okay, good.
You were very nimble in handling that transition to another device.
I'm using my phone, and it is currently being balanced against some earphones right now. So I'm glad that I'm still here.
No, you're coming through great.
Great. So from a reporter standpoint, the biggest challenge was communicating to the public what this new system was. And it was made especially challenging because there was this narrative that was going on in the national media about how absentee and mail-in ballots were the same. And it was basically pushing back against what Trump was trying to do to try and create some sort of differentiation between ballots that are proactively sent to people, like what's going on in Washington and Oregon, and the ones that you have to yourself proactively ask for, like in Missouri, for example. The problem was, though, that after the legislature passed the new system, there really was a difference between absentee and mail-in ballots. There was one system that I called absentee, where you could mail it, you could drop it off, you could vote absentee in person. There were certain excuses, like if you had either been diagnosed with or had certain health conditions related to COVID-19, where you didn't need a notary. You also didn't need a notary if you, I believe, for incapacity due to health. So that was absentee, and that was completely different from the mail-in option, which you could request for any reason, but had some very stringent requirements. For example, you couldn't drop it off at a polling place. It had to be mailed and it had to be notarized. So one of the things that I took upon myself was to write an article laying out the difference between these two systems. I talked with a lot of elections officials, including Eric and Rick, but as well as Brianna Lennon in Boone County and Kurt Barr in St. Charles County and the Secretary of State's office. And, you know, and oftentimes using Twitter to tell people like, yes, there is a difference in Missouri between these two systems. And to also point out, like when there was a court case about how you couldn't drop mail-in ballots off at a polling place, I kept trying to emphasize that these are just the mail-in ballots that you request without an excuse that have to be notarized and have to be mailed. These are not absentee ballots. You can drop those off. You can do absentee in person. I kind of felt like, even though sometimes I was getting repetitive doing this, and I don't know how that necessarily alleviated the confusion between the dual systems. My hope is that it enlightened some people, and therefore, like, they were able to maneuver through this process a lot easier. I think that there's a lot of elections officials in Missouri that would just like it to be no excuse. Like, you could ask for an absentee ballot for any reason. Like, maybe you are feeling, you know, like you really want to vote one day before the election during a particular period of time, and you just want to do it. You could either mail it back or do it in person. But that's just not the way the system is in Missouri. It's different in other states. So I understand that there is that distinction. That distinction between absentee and mail-in balloting is meaningless in like a state like Illinois, but it was very meaningful in Missouri. And I thought that the biggest challenge was explaining that distinction.
Those are great points from both of you. One thing I would add, so I'm teaching a class this semester. I got 15 students. None of them are actually from Missouri. And a few of them registered in Missouri, but most of them were actually voting absentee. And it was a reminder to me of just how varied all the absentee voter procedures are. And so I'd like to bring Tennyson and Lindsay back into this conversation, because this gets to, when we think about students, this gets directly to the question about how to engage and mobilize students on voting, because first you have to think about how they're voting. And one thing I was wondering is if either of you know whether there was an increase in the number of students who were voting in person versus absentee, absentee versus in person. I mean, this was a fundamental question in this election. How were, not just who were people going to vote for, but how were they going to vote? And I'm wondering how that engagement and education process operated in the run-up to Election Day.
Yeah, so we won't have full data on students who voted absentee versus in person until the spring semester. But what I can say is, so we had a lot of mail-in and absentee voting support throughout, both at the August primary as well as the November election. So we brought notaries to campus. We were providing, we have a subscription with TurboVote, which links people with the correct absentee form for their state. So if students were wanting to vote in any of the 50 states, I would send them the link and they'd have the correct form to fill it out, as well as an address to send it to, so that we could be sure that each student knew how to request their absentee ballot. We worked with the registrar's office to get data about each state, each student's home state. So we were able to send targeted information about their state's voting rules and their state's absentee voting rules to support students. And through that, what we saw was a significant uptick in people using our mail-in and absentee voting resources. So as I was talking about with those notary events, we had over 300 people come get their ballots notarized. We had a lot of people coming to a vote early day event and online virtual voter help hours to ask questions about their absentee voting. And so we were seeing a lot of students who were wanting to engage with mail ballots, but just had a few questions, as Jason was talking about with those logistics, as far as, is this a mail-in or an absentee ballot? We'd get some students at the notary events who brought their ballot request form to get notarized, which didn't need a notary because they thought that needed to be notarized instead of the ballot. And so it was kind of a learning curve as far as we were offering a lot of resources, but there was still some confusion between the different options and making sure that each student had the right offering for their state. But I think in the end, we definitely saw a significant uptick in people using those mail-in and absentee resources. And again, we won't know the final numbers until next semester, though.
Yeah, and then I can't
If I
provide.
can just,
Oh, I'm sorry.
go ahead, Tennyson, please. Go
I
ahead.
can't provide a concrete numerical answer or analytical answer per se, because I just don't have access to that information. But from what I've been hearing from students and just like from what I've been seeing on social media, just like the informal networks, a lot of what people did in terms of how they voted depended on where they were from a lot of times. So as like a lot of students got more engaged and learned that, oh, Ohio, Florida, Texas, Georgia, these are all swing states that I didn't know before, and then my vote matters more. A lot of students I know changed their registration from Missouri back to their home state because they were like aware, like, oh, my vote, quote unquote, means more in these states, or it's more valuable to whatever I'm trying to, or just to the election in general. And so I think a lot of students voted in person or absentee in Missouri, but a lot of mail-in votes came from students who were voting in those swing states out of state.
If I can just ask a quick follow-up question. Lindsay, or maybe Tennyson, you might know this. Do you have any idea on average what percentage of WashU undergrads vote in person, register and vote in Missouri versus in other states? And I know we don't know that yet for this election, but I realize I have no idea how that normally operates.
Yeah, we don't have exact numbers for that, but we usually see it's around 50-50 in Missouri versus other states. So that's how we allocated our resources, as far as assuming that 50% of people would be voting in their home state. And so what would that mean for how many stamps and envelopes do we need for students, et cetera, were the assumptions we used this year.
Interesting. So one of the fundamental questions in this election was about information access and disinformation access. One of the things that both Jason and Eric already spoke about is simply the way that uncertainty and confusion could play a part in this election, with people not necessarily knowing how to cast their ballot. But then looking beyond that, this was an election in which people nationwide were saying people are being inundated with information and there's a lot of inaccurate information. And I'm wondering if that, for any of you, was something that you were observing in the weeks both before the election and since then, whether that was students who were battling to find out what correct information was, or whether questions were coming into you, Eric, or we're now joined by Rick Stream as well, about whether you were getting questions that suggested people were receiving disinformation, and whether, as a journalistic observer, Jason, one thing there has been this keen interest in is disinformation, and whether you saw that playing a role in this election. And any one of you can begin this discussion. Folks are thinking about this. I'm going to ask Eric and Rick. And one way to start might be, did you receive outlandish questions that would suggest that people were really receiving inaccurate information about the election process?
This is Eric, and I know Rick is, although he's on there, he's dealing with something right now, but
I'm sure.
Yeah, we receive outlandish questions all the time, every year.
I see.
So it was nothing new. Like I mentioned before, I would say that the intensity of the questions was different than probably in years past. We always, especially in national election, we receive a lot of questions from the public. It's always difficult to convey all the correct information to folks, because folks have, these tendencies to remember what happened in past years and aren't necessarily, up to date on all the little election law changes, which, who is, other than people who work in the election office. So we get that. But to my point, I think people were just much more concerned and curious about what is going to happen to their ballot and how does this process work. And so the questions around that, sometimes were outlandish, sometimes were frustrating, but I think to a certain extent that's to be expected. But it was just, especially this year in Missouri, since the laws changed around absentee voting in the middle of the year, essentially, that was something new for a lot of people to learn. And then it's just hard in a media market like St. Louis, where it spans 2 states and the voting laws in Illinois are completely different. It was confusing for people. And in Missouri, where the voting procedures from county to county are even different. So that's difficult for people to wrap their minds around sometimes if they're not paying very close attention. So we did see that, and I think that was to be expected to a certain extent.
I think in any election cycle, there's going to be disinformation. I think it's become an especially big problem in the last 4 years. We're kind of seeing that play out post-election, where some people are trying to say that this is the same as 2000 when it's not. Like, there's not a 547 vote margin in Florida that's separating any of the presidential candidates in any state that matters. But I think that Trump's communications directors put out a doctored Washington Times newspaper that says Gore wins, even though there was no point at any point in 2000 where any network called Gore the winner. They said that he had Florida. They said it was too close to call. They gave it to Bush. It was too close to call. And there was the protracted fight over who won. I was 14 then, but yes, I do remember that. I may not be able to remember what I did 2 weeks ago, but I do remember the 2000 election cycle. So it's challenging because no matter how many times you try to amplify truth or try to amplify context, there's going to be a segment that just believes what they want to believe. And at a certain point, the only thing you can do as a journalist is amplify accurate information and not amplify disinformation, and hope that you can get through to as many people as possible. But especially in this environment, there are going to be people who are going to believe disinformation no matter how many times you say it's not true. And you have to question to yourself, do you really want to try to break through to a person that's not listening to you? Or are you going to try to break through to people that have legitimate questions? Like, for example, like people that are legitimately confused about the new absentee mail-in dual system in Missouri, and they want to know like how it would work for them. I think that is a better use of my time. And just another thing that I did kind of as a way to do election coverage is I spent quite a bit of time going to individual candidates and doing long form interviews with them, including some interviews with candidates in races that may not have seemed competitive. Like, I actually went to St. Charles and did a podcast with a St. Charles senator as well as his Democratic opponent, even though I knew that that race was not going to be close. And when you have that one-on-one opportunity with a principal, you do have an opportunity to ask them questions and to also push back against assertions that may be questionable. I think that was especially a fun challenge on my part when I interviewed the pro and con sides of Amendment 3, because unlike a lot of reporters in Missouri, and this is going to sound braggadocious, but I don't care, I have a lot of knowledge and expertise about the state legislative redistricting program here, because I actually was around in 2011 and 2012 when it played out. So I don't necessarily need to be told how it worked, because I was there and I saw how it worked with my own eyes. So I think that that is one of the benefits you have with experience. Unfortunately, a lot of political reporters in Missouri now have not been around for 14 years like I have. When I started off in journalism in 2006 as a 22-year-old reporter, there were reporters that had been around for 30 and 40 years. My former colleague, Joe Manis, and I worked together from about 2011 to, I believe the very beginning of 2019. She had like 4 decades of institutional knowledge. She still, comes out of retirement every now and then, but when you don't have the institutional knowledge that was there at the beginning of my career, even if you try to use your own institutional knowledge that is admittingly fairly limited, I don't think 14 years is that long. You're just going to run into a lot of challenges. And it goes back to what I was saying before. You can try to say, hey, I was there, this is what happened, but people are still going to believe what they want to believe. And it's frustrating and disappointing, but you got to just try to reach as many people as you can.
I also think, coming just off what Jason said and Eric a little bit, is from the student side, a lot of students, I believe, are now not believing everything they see on social media. So that's a big problem, especially for us younger folks, because we're addicted to our phones. We're always looking down, and we get a lot of our news from just social media in general. And I think because there was so much information and then also so much disinformation at the same time, that forced people to start going to your local election authority and asking questions instead of just seeing some tweet or some infographic on Instagram and just believing that, or going to the Secretary of State's website and getting accurate information, opposed to just more stuff on Facebook or whatever. And I hope that that's the general trend going forward, as even like in future elections that might not be as important or as crucial. I just hope that people do their own research and own digging from credible sources that are nonpartisan or nonpartisan or just non-biased in any ways, because that is like the biggest thing that is like creating a divide within our country and just creating just arguments about stuff that we shouldn't be arguing about in general.
Yeah, in response to Tennyson's comment about getting news from social media, in early October or late September, maybe, there was a post that was circulating around social media that was like, if you don't trust the USPS system, take your ballot in person. All 50 states will let you take your mail ballot to the local election authority. And this was an infographic that was circling. I saw it multiple places and multiple times on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. And so suddenly we were having to do the work of informing our students that actually, no, in Missouri, you can't take your mail-in ballot back to the election authority. It has to go through USPS. So it's kind of this, we were getting pushback from social media, but the social media was inaccurate. And then that led to more confusion for our students in already trying to navigate the different intricacies of absentee versus mail-in voting. So that was something that we ran up against. And then later on in the cycle, we were running more into students from states that don't require a notary, thinking they've required a notary just because they'd heard so much from their friends who were voting in Missouri who did need a notary, and were suddenly thinking that they also needed a notary. So I think a lot of the misinformation, disinformation that I interacted with while I was speaking with students was all about procedural process type things as far as casting a vote. And a lot of that, again, came directly from social media.
So it's very interesting. And, you know, one thing I want to ask about is I want to get us to election day. These are one thing that what every one of you is saying is that there were all of these variables at work. And I want to see if we can recapture that day. And I hope the questions we get from the participants will connect to that as well. Because one thing we haven't talked about as much is the impact of the pandemic. So obviously that would affect the number of people who voted in person versus absentee or by mail. But then let's focus on, for a moment, on how election day operated in person, because obviously that has an effect on all of you. So as you observed students, what was it like for them to vote on election day in person during a pandemic? Jason, I'm wondering, as a journalist, what was it like to cover this when you couldn't get up close to people at a polling place and ask them questions close up? And I'm thinking, Eric, of your point about how you're really running two elections, but then one of those elections you're running means you've got to assure the physical safety of your team working the elections. And I'm just wondering how all of that played out. And I think about this because often in previous elections, election day ends with coverage of some polling place that has an extraordinarily long line at the moment that the polling place is supposed to close, and they let everyone in. And I was struck, I'm sure that was still the case in this election, but I was struck by the degree to which that coverage was far less prevalent than the focus on understanding the mechanics of voting in during a pandemic. So any one of you can jump in. I'll actually ask Jason, was covering this different because of the pandemic? Mechanics of covering.
Oh, definitely. So just for a little context, and this has been traditional since I guess started at St. Louis Public Radio in 2014. I don't really do a huge amount of reporting during the day, but during elections, probably because traditionally there are election watch parties that I'm assigned to go to, as was the case in 2014, 2016, as well as 2018. This time, though, there were no watch parties. So I woke up at 6 a.m. I myself went to vote in Richmond Heights and waited in a line for about 45, 50 minutes before I got inside. So I experienced for myself the long line. I decided to vote in person just because I had no real reason not to do that. And then what I did was, since there was no watch parties that I really was assigned to, I got a sense of where certain candidates were going to be during the day, like right before they voted or whether they were talking to voters. And I went to Baldwin, I went to Clayton, I went to Creve Coeur, and I got sound from them in the event that I wasn't able to get them after the election actually happened. So my day election, doing my election time during the day was actually a lot busier this time because I knew that I wasn't going to have a lot of opportunity to catch candidates after they won, just because there was no watch parties of note. And so I did that. I spent a little time with my kids. I went for a run. I had dinner. And then I went to the office. I'm actually at St. Louis Public Radio right now. And I basically was in one of these studios most of the time, effectively like refreshing all of some various results all over the state. So obviously I was looking at St. Louis County because I was paying attention to the 2nd congressional district race between Ann Wagner and Jill Shoup, as well as the one between Andrew Koenig and Deb Lavender. But I was also looking at St. Charles and Jefferson County and Boone County and some other counties, just to get a sense of like what some of the statewide numbers were, because some of those counties have an impact on a race like the governor's race between Mike Parson and Galloway. And so what I ended up doing for most of the night was just like refreshing the results and looking at trends. And when it was pretty clear, like people were going to win, I said that this person won. And that was the case in the governor's race, where it was clear like Parson was going to win by a pretty sizable margin. Other races needed some more time to be called. Like once I saw that Ann Wagner had won St. Louis County outright, I felt pretty safe going on Twitter and saying that she had won, because the expectation was that she was not going to win St. Louis County. And the idea for her path to victory was more of can she make up votes in St. Charles and Jefferson County. If she wins St. Louis County, she wins, because she clearly is going to win those other 2 counties. So that's a verbose way of saying that I spent most of the election night at the studio checking results, kind of filling in stories that I had already pre-written. Some were not surprises. It was not a surprise Cori Bush won. In fact, I had that entire story written 3 or 4 days before. But I had 2 different versions of the Ann Wagner-Jill Shoup race, because that was a little bit less certain. And the one that really surprised me was Amendment 3 passing, which did repeal the Clean Missouri state legislative redistricting system. I was so certain that that was not going to pass that I honestly hesitated on writing a no version to it. I still did. And it turned out that that was the right move, because it ended up passing by a fairly narrow margin. So, yeah, it was a lot different because I didn't go to an election watch party, and I spent most of the time in studio just kind of checking the results. That is atypical. And I'm hoping that in 2022, I will be back at a watch party and being able to see a candidate either declare victory or concede in person.
Thank you. Eric, what was it like?
Sure. Election day here was pretty similar to what election days are normally in election office, which is hectic, and you're just constantly putting out fires, and poll workers not showing up, filling them in. People can't get into buildings, getting the buildings open in the morning, and then dealing with issues as they come up on election day. I will say that for a presidential election, election day was relatively uneventful, and I think that has to do mostly with the fact that 40% of the people had voted prior to election day. And that makes a big difference. And that's the point. Somebody made the point earlier that county clerks and election authorities across the state of Missouri overwhelmingly support the concept of no excuse absentee voting. And from an administrative side, the purpose of that support is to kind of spread out the burden of administering the election. So when you have 90% of your customers, essentially, you're trying to serve them in one day with a volunteer workforce of 3,000 people, you're going to have issues. And we had a few issues on election day, but they were relatively minor compared to what we normally deal with. So we were pleasantly surprised. The lines were heavy in the morning, as Jason mentioned, but they really dissipated once we got into the afternoon. You know, as long as you keep the lines moving, you know, we found in presidential elections, especially, people tend to really queue up in the morning. And then by the time you get to the afternoon, there aren't many people left to vote. And that's kind of how it played out. So overall, that was good. And I think hopefully the lesson that maybe the folks in the state legislature take away is that this election went pretty well in Missouri. And so I think if you give election authorities a little more latitude on how to give voters, I should say, a little more latitude in how they cast their ballot, and then us a little more time to get those ballots prepared and counted, you know, things will run relatively smooth.
So one thing I'd like to do, first of all, I've learned from this that I should vote next time I vote in person, I should vote in the afternoon, which I didn't know. So that's in addition to everything else I've learned today. One thing I want to make sure we have time to do is to answer questions from the viewers. And a number of these are questions that really get to some key points that people are raising here that all of you have raised. So it'll give us a chance to talk about them. We have some really great questions here. I want to start with one question we've got, which gets to the heart of what people have been debating right now, which is one attendee wrote, how worried do we actually need to be about voter fraud affecting the outcome of these races, either within Missouri or nationally? And I know that question probably goes very much to you, Rick, but there may be others who want to jump in here. And I'm going to add one other thing to this that might help with this, which is after Election Day, what happens to all those ballots? How are they tabulated? What becomes of them? What are the processes that you use?
So this is Eric. I have a fairly standard answer I always share with people when the issue of voter fraud comes up. It is, I think, a very well-known and frankly should be accepted fact that voter fraud or fraud in elections in general is exceedingly rare, but nobody should pretend that it never happens. We have had a couple cases in St. Louis County over the last decade of people who had tried to commit absentee ballot fraud, but they were caught. They're being prosecuted. And I mentioned those instances to remind people that voter fraud does sometimes occur, especially in municipal elections. That's been our experience. People usually don't try to cheat in national elections because there are just too many ballots to try to affect the outcome. But our system works because we caught those people, and there are a lot of protections in place. So voter fraud is exceedingly rare. What's a little less rare is administrative error. So election administrators, myself included, we sometimes make mistakes, which can affect the administration of the election. But I think people can be very confident that, at least in St. Louis County and across Missouri, everything was conducted in accordance with state law, and fraud in this election is not a concern. And it's always important to remind people that in Missouri and in St. Louis County, everything is done in a bipartisan manner. The ballots are counted, prepared, tabulated, opened, processed, all those things in a bipartisan manner. Democrat and Republican are sitting across from each other doing all those things across Missouri. So folks should have confidence in elections. And I think once, you know, all the dust settles from this election, despite what some rhetoric might say, that, you know, people can have confidence in the result.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add anything on that? I realize this is very much a question for Eric, but I was wondering if anyone else wanted to add anything.
Just very quickly, because I don't want to filibuster, because I know there's four other questions. I would agree with Eric that there are sometimes rare examples of fraud, and there are rare examples of where administrative errors affect elections. But in order for it to affect an election, it requires an election to be extremely close. And I think Eric Erickson, who's a conservative pundit out of Georgia, pointed out that the margins in places like Michigan and Georgia and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, the margins are not close. And so the amount of voter fraud you would have to prove is just so statistically impossible that while I understand that people believe it happened on a wide scale, it's one thing to believe it. It's another thing to prove it, to actually overturn a result of an election, which is why I have a lot of confidence in saying, like, none of the results in any of the states that have been called for Biden are going to be overturned.
How does the counting process actually occur? I realize we can't speak to how that operates in every state. And we've had some questions about that, about national versus state-based management of voting. But if we look here at Missouri, how are ballots actually counted? Someone wrote in to ask about that. It's a really good question. And a related one is, as Americans watched the election play out, you would see votes from, it kind of went in fits and starts. You know, there would suddenly be 10,000 votes here, 5,000 votes there. So I'm wondering both how ballots are counted and then how that information is released.
I can speak for St. Louis County. In Missouri, the state law allows election authorities to start opening the absentee and mail ballots 5 days before the election. So we bring in a plethora of bipartisan teams. We set up, a bunch of tables in our warehouse, and they start opening these ballots. We start scanning those ballots, through a scanner at that point. And then once 7 p.m. arrives on election night, we take a USB drive from the scanner and put it into a tabulating computer and actually tabulate those absentee and mail ballots. And then, of course, the ballots from the polling places, there are scanners at each polling place. The poll workers bring those flash drives and actual paper ballots back to the election office in each county. The election office, the election authority, they receive those materials and they plug those drives in and they tabulate the polling place votes. And then there are some votes in Missouri that are counted post-election, and it's a small minority of votes, but it's an important minority, especially if the election is very close. So at least in our case in St. Louis County, the absentee and mail ballots we receive on election day, those are counted in the subsequent days because we don't have time to do it on election day. Then the military and overseas ballots, the deadline for us to receive those is the Friday after the election, as long as they're postmarked by election day. And then, of course, provisional ballots. Those are the most labor-intensive ballots for voters that there was some uncertainty with their voter registration status on election day. So those are set aside. And then post-election, the election authority has to do some investigation as to whether or not those people were entitled to vote. And if they were, then those ballots are counted. In Missouri, we have 14 days as the election authority to go through all those and certify the final count. So we don't have in any election, we don't have a final result, an official final result, until 2 Tuesdays after the election. But we will periodically throughout that certification period update the results as we count more ballots.
Thank you. So I realize we're learning a lot about the technical aspects of voting. In the time we have remaining, I want to circle back to how this is experienced by students. And what intrigues me, and I'm going to ask a question of Lindsay and Tennyson that's going to be a tough one to answer, which is I'm going to ask you to speak on behalf of all students, because we had a number of questions that are particularly about what's going to happen in the future. We have one question about what happens if President Trump not only does not concede, but refuses to surrender the instruments of power that he has as president. I don't know if that's something that any of us can explain here today. Likewise, we have someone who wrote in and said, do we foresee any national effort to standardize federal elections? And what all of these reflect is a kind of sense of anxiety about how this election is proceeding. People have voted, but where we're heading is far less certain. We began with Tennyson talking about how, in your case, your own sense of what mattered to you had changed since 2016. And likewise, if we think about it, the 2008 and 2012 elections were relatively straightforward. People thought it was pretty clear who was going to win a few days before. The results reflected many of those predictions. And there was a relatively straightforward process of Barack Obama becoming president and then securing his reelection. 2016 was less certain. Now there seems to be tremendous uncertainty. And I'm wondering to what degree you are observing that among students. What are they saying about this, either personally, which is very limited due to the pandemic, or on social media? Do they foresee a situation a month from now where we have a president who refuses to leave office? Or do they see this as a tempest in the teapot, that eventually Trump will, if he does not concede, he will at least acknowledge that he's out of a job in a little over 2 months?
Well, I think first, at least amongst the student circles I've talked about, the bigger threat I perceived was if Trump won by razor thin margins, like the result, what would happen in terms of like protesting and whatever per se. But I think the bigger thing that I'm noticing from students is that regardless of political affiliation or ideology, because everyone voted in so many different places, people are realizing there's such big disparities on how easy and hard it is to vote in different states. And I think people are like now realizing, regardless of ideology, is that we need more uniform voting across just the country in general. And I think that's going to be a bigger call coming from younger people, where it's like, I think the myth of Republicans not doing well in high turnout elections has changed, definitely. And I think because of that, people are now going to realize, like, let's just make it easier for people to vote in general. And let's make it this uniform. So regardless of where you're voting, it's pretty much the same process. And I'm not sure what the process, like how that's going to look like going forward, but I think that that's going to start being a call from just young people in general, just because this was our first election. We're noticing that it's really hard in some places, easier in others, and that it just got to be easier all around.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really like what you're just saying, Tennyson, because it's showing how students are going to continue to be engaged past the election. So yes, we had all the student energy before the election. Yes, we have all the student energy to actually turn out to vote. But then how do we continue holding elected officials accountable? How do we continue improving systems so that we can stay engaged and that more people have access to our democracy, et cetera, moving forward into the future? So I think a lot of what I've talked about with other students has been about, say Biden and Harris win. How do we hold them accountable? What are the actions that we need to be taking right now that are beyond our voting in order to continue move this country forward, to advocate for the changes that each student wants to see in the country, et cetera, so that the engagement and the civic engagement doesn't end at the voting booth, doesn't end on election day, but it's an ongoing process in order to fight for changes that young people want to see.
Those are great points, and they really bring us to a kind of final question looking forward that I'd like to ask everyone. And to a certain degree, Tennyson and Lindsay, you've already answered that, which is to say, here are things that people need to mobilize and organize around. Tennyson, you've emphasized that people should think about, even if there is not a national agency that supervises elections, there might be ways to think about how voting can be more similar in different states. That may be one of the lessons from this. Lindsay, of course, reminds us of the tremendous importance of mobilization and engagement. I would also ask Eric and Jason, as you think about moving forward, so ideally, our next election will not be during a pandemic. Let's hope that's the case. Assuming that is the case, I know that you're still going to need some time to process and make sense of this election. I'm wondering, though, even now, a week out, if there's anything you've observed that's going to inform how you either administer the next election or how you cover the next election. And let's focus now on the next presidential election. Let's try to think 4 years from now, whether there's anything that you think you might want to do differently, or if there's something that you emerged from this thinking, here is something that worked really well that must remain in place.
I'll go ahead unless Jason, you wanted to jump in there first. A couple things. I think it will be interesting to see to what extent Congress tries to address election administration from a national level. Traditionally, this has been done very rarely in only extraordinary circumstances. I'm thinking of the Voting Rights Act from 1965. Thinking of the Motor Voter Law from 1993, the National Voter Registration Act, and the Help America Vote Act 2002. If Republicans maintain control of the U.S. Senate, I think prospects are unlikely that things will be addressed at a national level, because Roy Blunt, one of our senators from Missouri, is chairman of the Senate Rules Committee. And Roy Blunt, you have to remember, was the county clerk of Greene County, Missouri, and Missouri Secretary of State. Roy Blunt has been very upfront in that he does not, at least historically, he has not been in favor of quote unquote nationalizing elections. And I think probably a lot of election administrators, regardless of party, would probably agree with him that election administrators really don't like being told by the federal government how to run elections. But what's interesting is there are some issues cropping up from this election, as we can see. And Republicans, I think Senator Hawley has already mentioned that he might try to introduce a bill to do with rules about mail-in voting. So Democrats in the House of Representatives past session were very keen on, expanding early and mail-in voting and things like that. Maybe some compromise could be reached, across party lines somehow. But traditionally, Congress has really been hesitant to do those types of things. Just personally, what I would like to see prior to the next presidential election, and I just want to correct one thing you said, Peter. Our next election will be during a pandemic, because our next election is in April of 2021. St. Louis City has one in March of 2021.
True.
So,
good point.
Our next elections, it's just the fact that most people don't vote in them. And if the students at WashU would ever, if more than one or two would ever vote in an April election, they could completely change the makeup of like the Clayton or U City School Board, by the way, if they ever wanted to do that. But I would just say that I think on a national level, what election administrators want to see Congress do is perhaps allocate more resources for election administration and implement new certification guidelines for voting technology. Our voting technology guidelines are very outdated. They're from 2005. They haven't been updated. So those are the two things a lot of election administrators want to see. I know they're like kind of inside baseball things. I personally wouldn't hold out a whole lot of hope or angst about Congress changing voting laws nationally.
Jason.
So one of the things that I am foreseeing, and this is not an optimistic statement, is I think we're going to see a great constriction in traditional media. So I started my career in 2006 at a newspaper in Columbia, Missouri, one that at the time had enough resources to send me to every Democrat day in Hannibal, and I was able to go to Springfield and St. Louis and Kansas City and travel across Northeast Missouri and go cover presidential candidates in all corners of the state. I went and saw Barack Obama in Rolla, Missouri. Granted, the mileage reimbursement was kind of pathetic, but that does add up after a while. Flash forward to now, the Columbia Tribune is a shell of its former self. It was bought by Gatehouse and just disemboweled, and it's now part of Gannett, and it is such a tragedy the way that paper has disintegrated. And it's not surprising, because newspapers, I feel like, are no longer the dominant information conduit that many young people, and even not so young people like myself, I'm 36, use. People are using things like their phones and their computers, and also like podcasting in various ways to consume information. And traditional media outlets, I don't think, have kept up with that. And you're going to see, especially on a more localized level, a continued degradation of the news environment in smaller markets. Even in a larger market like St. Louis, we have seen some real constriction. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which is still the largest and most renowned news outlet in St. Louis, has shed staff for years because they're so in debt to the crushing debt that Lee used to buy them back in the 2000s. St. Louis Public Radio has gone through financial issues because of the pandemic. And I am worried about this because we were talking about misinformation. I'm not saying that traditional journalists are somehow the kingmakers of all truth. Sometimes we screw up and sometimes we lose our ability to be credible. But I would say that for the most part, a lot of reporters who work for traditional mainstream news outlets strive for accuracy and strive to be fair and strive to provide information to the public that they need. And my hope is that we do see different type of news outlets that still carry on those values, even if they're not under the banner of a newspaper that's been around for 150 years. I think we've seen kind of the maturation of online news outlets that have become more essential to news consumption. Like, for example, in 2006 and 2008, things like Huffington Post and Slate and, BuzzFeed, and Politico, those were seen as novelties. Now they're seen as kind of on the same level as, a major newspaper or broadcast entity. But it does concern me, though, that even if you still have major outlets that are doing national news, you're not going to have that same level of intensity on a state and local level. And with that degradation of that environment, you're going to have a rise of misinformation. You're going to have a rise of media that's not curious or are trying to ask tough questions of people in power. And I just think that will just be a complete loss for people, because what we're trying to do as journalists is provide accurate information and sometimes analysis to people. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I'm not optimistic, because to create a vibrant news economy, you need money, and the money is drying up because of the pandemic, and it's drying up from places like newspapers, which are no longer seen as viable. Hopefully we have this panel in 4 years and I can say that I'm wrong. That's my hope.
Thank you. These were all terrific comments, and they suggest what are some real concerns and challenges as we look to the future. We're still not even out of this election. And one of the things that we are seeing is that managing elections is really challenging, and that elections can be really close. And what I've found so wonderful in the comments from everyone is we've learned, first of all, how elections play out and also what they mean, both for the people involved with them and for the students who participate in them and who are so committed to them. I want to thank all of our guests tonight. I want to thank our panelists, Eric, Lindsay, Tennyson, Jason, Rick. I know you joined us, but my understanding is you're completely consumed by completing the process of completing our election here in Missouri. This event was also organized by a committee from the Gephardt Institute. I want to thank them for their involvement with this. And I especially want to thank the Gephardt Institute for all of their work in organizing this event and bringing it together and publicizing it and in managing the technology. And finally, I want to thank all of you who joined us this evening and say thank you for your terrific questions. Thank you for being engaged, and thank you for being committed to a political process. Have a good evening.